Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing cannabis. Okay, so we've now discussed then the cannabis high. We've discussed the effects that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the active ingredient of cannabis, has on the brain. And these effects can be divided into two major categories: the depressant effects, which are similar to those caused by alcohol but without the recklessness that alcohol causes, and the psychotomimetic effects, where it can produce symptoms similar to psychosis, specifically illusions, and more rarely hallucinations. Finally, there's also a third category of the mental effects of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is that it raises appetite. Okay, now, the cannabis high, which is the effects that we've just described, usually happens for about 2 to 3 hours after actually taking the cannabis. However, of course, it ends, and that is because the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is being removed from your blood, and when it is removed from the blood, it will also leave the brain. As its level falls down in the blood, it will also fall down in the brain. Okay, so let's just discuss a few points about the pharmacokinetics then of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. So how is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol removed from the blood? Well, it can be metabolized by the liver. Okay, so it's metabolized to lots of other molecules, and these other molecules can then be excreted in two ways from the body. Okay, one of the major routes is that the metabolites of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol are excreted into the bile, and then the bile is excreted into the intestine, and then the metabolite will be excreted in the feces. The alternative route, which is less common, is that the metabolite will go back into the blood after it's been produced in the liver, and then it will end up being excreted by the kidneys into the urine. Okay, now this is the basis of drug screening tests for the use of cannabis. In the urine, we can look for the presence of the metabolites of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Urine tests do not look for delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol itself because it doesn't get excreted in any large detectable amount. Instead, they look for the metabolites of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which are excreted in the urine in much higher levels and detectable levels. Okay, another key point to note about the pharmacokinetics of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is that because it's such a lipophilic molecule, it's very hydrophobic, it actually can end up getting stored in the fat. Okay, so when you initially take cannabis and it's initially you have very high levels of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol in the blood, what happens is fat cells all around your body start taking up the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol like crazy. So they store loads of it in the fat, okay? And then what happens is the liver starts to gain control. It starts to break down the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol that's in the blood into metabolites and excrete those from the body. So the level of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol in the blood falls, and then over a very long period, which can last for months after actually taking the cannabis, what will happen is the fat will be releasing the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol that it's got stored in it back into the blood. So it can last up to a month. For about a month after taking cannabis, you will have little levels of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol still in your blood, which is because your fat cells are releasing delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol into the bloodstream. A little bit at a time, they're offloading the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol that they took up when you were having the cannabis high, so when you'd initially taken the cannabis. Okay, and for that reason, there can still be metabolites of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol in your urine weeks after you've actually taken the cannabis, and it's because the fat is releasing delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol into the blood, and then the liver is breaking it down, and then the metabolites are then being excreted by the kidneys into the urine. Okay, so that's an important point about the pharmacokinetics of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Let's now talk then about the come down or the crash or the hangover effect that occurs after actually taking cannabis. Okay, so in the come down, what happens is the exact opposite of what happens in the high. Okay, so you generally feel in a very, very bad mood. So in the high, you feel in a very, very good mood. You feel very happy. You feel euphoric. In the come down, you don't feel euphoric at all. Instead, you feel in a very bad mood, so you feel very unhappy. And the fancy word for very unhappy is dysphoric, i.e. you are experiencing dysphoria rather than euphoria. Okay, so you feel dysphoric, so unhappy. You also generally feel very unrelaxed, so you feel agitated and anxious. Okay, so the opposite of relaxed. So agitated and anxious, and in addition, you'll generally also have a lower appetite, so anorexia is also a symptom. Okay, so anxiety as well. Okay, but these are the main symptoms that you get in the come down from cannabis. So it swings in the opposite direction after you've actually after the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol has gone back to low levels. Okay, so you get the exact opposite effect of what you've been enjoying for the few hours that you were in the cannabis high. Okay, so that's the come down then. What I now want to discuss is addiction to delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabis addiction. Now, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is not as addictive as many other addictive drugs. So for instance, it's nothing compared to cocaine, okay? And indeed, some people say that cannabis is actually no more addictive than coffee or nicotine, okay? So it doesn't take hold of your life in the same way that cocaine does, where it almost becomes a compulsive habit of taking the drug. Okay, so firstly, let me just define what is actually meant by addiction. Okay, so the definition of addiction is this. You continue to seek and take the drug. So you continue to go out and buy the drug and then take it, even though you can see that it's destroying your life. Okay, so maybe your partner has left you, maybe you've lost your friends because they don't like your drug habit, you might have lost your job because your boss doesn't like your drug habit, your bank balance might be going through the floor, you might be facing losing your house because you can't pay your rent, you might be reduced to criminal activity to get the money to buy the drug. You can see that it's destroying your life, okay, and that you might end up in prison because of it, but you still take the drug. So even though you can consciously see that it's ruined your life, you still continue to take the drug. That's the definition of being addicted to a drug. Cannabis, as I say, does not have a particularly strong tendency to cause this. However, it does to an extent cause it. Okay, so some people do end up with a cannabis habit where they take cannabis on a very, very regular basis. They take cannabis, they get the high, and then when they start to feel the come down, they take it again, and then when they obviously then get the high again, and then when they feel the come down coming on, they take it again. So they continue to take it again and again and again to try and maintain themselves on a high. Okay, and if they were to suddenly stop taking it, they would experience what is known as psychological withdrawal. Okay, now psychological withdrawal is basically a bigger and badder version of a come down. Okay, so the come down is what happens if you take it just once. Okay, psychological withdrawal is if you've got a habit going with the cannabis and then you suddenly break that habit and stop taking the drug, then you get psychological withdrawal. So psychological withdrawal, in psychological withdrawal, you will also feel incredibly dysphoric, so you'll feel incredibly unhappy, you'll feel very agitated and anxious. You'll feel, to an extent, quite unwell, okay? So this is really the definition of psychological withdrawal. It's all about feeling as though you are very, very ill, i.e. physically ill, even though there's not actually anything physically wrong with you. Okay, so it's the brain feeling as though it's ill because of the lack of the drug, even though there's nothing actually physically wrong with you. And cannabis does cause psychological withdrawal, okay? And you will get cravings for the cannabis. That's another key part of psychological withdrawal, that whilst you're in this period of feeling very, very ill because of the lack of the drug, you also get intense cravings for the drug, okay? But although it does cause psychological dependence in this way, that brain cannot function normally anymore without the drug and will make you feel very ill if you stop taking the drug, it's nothing compared to what cocaine does. Cocaine, it gets to the point, it hijacks the brain so much that it almost becomes compulsive, that you simply cannot stop taking the drug. I always like the analogy to Harry Potter, so beware, here comes a Harry Potter analogy. Okay, in Harry Potter, there is a spell, the Imperious Curse, which can control someone. Okay, where a dark wizard can control another wizard. Okay, and if you're very, very strong, like Harry, if you've got very powerful mind determination, you can resist this spell. I compare cocaine addiction kind of to that. Okay, you can, if you're very, very strong, fight it and stop the cocaine controlling you, but usually the cocaine has a very strong influence and it just controls your behaviour, and it really does become to the point that you can't actually consciously stop taking the cocaine without a really, really mind struggle, basically. Okay, so it does hijack the brain and take over and begin to control you like a robot, whereas cannabis doesn't do anything to that sort of level. It does alter the brain in some way so that the brain believes that it needs the drug in order to be healthy, but it is give-upable, okay? And some people do indeed say that it's no more addictive than coffee. So that's cannabis addiction, or rather the lack of addiction to cannabis. What we'll now discuss is what is understood about the mechanisms by which cannabis, the active ingredient of cannabis, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, actually triggers the effects that we've seen. Okay, and we'll specifically just look at how does it cause the high, what is known about how it causes the high. Okay, so for this, what I need to tell you about is a receptor that we have found which delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol activates all over the brain. Okay, so I think I'll go onto the other side to actually show this. So, there is a receptor that we have found that is on loads of the neurons all over the brain, which is activated by delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And this receptor is called the CB1 receptor, the cannabinoid 1 receptor. So CB here is for cannabinoid. Okay, and a cannabinoid is just a molecule that has a similar chemical structure to delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Okay, so there is a receptor that is found on loads of neurons all over the brain, so it's found in loads of different brain areas, called the CB1 receptor. And this is a G protein coupled receptor. So if I draw a picture of it, here is the cell membrane, so here is the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. Let's say this side is the extracellular fluid and this side is the cytoplasmic side. Okay, a G protein coupled receptor is a protein which has this characteristic 7 membrane spanning alpha helices structure. Okay, so it spans the membrane 7 times. It has its amino terminus extracellularly and its C terminus intracellularly. So if I wanted to draw a picture then of the cannabinoid 1 receptor, the CB1 receptor, this would be it. Okay, it is a polypeptide which spans the membrane 7 times like so. Okay, now this receptor, as I say, it's found all over the brain. So let me just draw a little picture of the brain here. So here is my picture of the brain. Here's the cerebral hemispheres. Here is the pons, the medulla, and then going into the spinal cord. And then behind the brainstem we'll have the cerebellum here. So all over the brain, neurons have the cannabinoid 1 receptor, the CB1 receptor. Okay, and delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is a exogenous ligand for this receptor. So delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol can bind to the CB1 receptor on neurons all over the brain. So when you take cannabis, you'll get delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol going up in your blood. It'll then cross the blood-brain barrier easily because it's lipophilic. It'll get into the brain and then it will start binding to these CB1 receptors on the surface of neurons all over the brain. And what it will do is it will trigger a change in the conformation of this receptor. The receptor will then adopt an active conformation on the inside and it will activate pathways inside the cell. Okay, and if you are familiar with the G protein coupled receptor cascades, it actually activates the GI/naught cascade, which then leads to cyclic AMP going down within the cell. Okay, if you're not familiar with G protein coupled receptor signaling, don't worry about that. All you need to know is that it causes some sort of effect inside the cell. Okay, right. So the important understanding here then is that all over the brain we've got neurons with this cannabinoid 1 receptor. Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol binds to these CB1 receptors all over the brain, and then is going to cause changes in the behavior of all of the different portions of the brain with these CB1 receptors in. And this then is believed to be why delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol actually triggers all of these different effects, all of these strange effects on the brain, because the CB1 receptors all over the brain doing different things, regulating different things in the different regions of the brain. Okay, now it's not particularly well understood what the CB1 receptor is actually used to do in the different areas of the brain, i.e. what is it actually regulating, okay? But we do believe this is the means by which delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol actually has effects on the brain, by binding to this receptor and then changing the activity in those different areas of the brain, and thereby causing all of the different effects. Now, just before we finish this video, I do want to just mention the endocannabinoids. So you might be wondering, this CB1 receptor, okay, we've got this molecule, delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the active ingredient of the cannabis plant, but is this receptor here just for those people who take cannabis so that it can actually have an effect? Well, of course the answer is no. So the question then becomes, what is the actual intended ligand? What is the actual intended activating molecule for this receptor? Okay, and the intended molecules, the natural molecules which are meant to activate these receptors, are called endocannabinoids. Okay, molecules that are endogenous to the body which have an effect similar to the cannabinoid delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the active ingredient of cannabis. Okay, and two of the major endocannabinoids that have received a lot of attention and a lot of study so far are the endocannabinoid anandamide, denoted AEA. Okay, so this is called anandamide. Its full name is arachidiol ethanolamine, which explains why it's denoted AEA. So this stands for, in full, arachidiol, that's the first A, and then ethanolamine, it's a massive great name. Ethanol is the E, and then amine is the second A there. Okay, and it's a derivative of arachidonic acid. It's just arachidonic acid bound to ethanolamine. Okay, so that's anandamide or arachidiol ethanolamine AEA. That's one of the endocannabinoids. So that will activate the CB1 receptor, and indeed this is used inside the brain to endogenously activate CB1 receptors. And another endocannabinoid is 2-arachidinyl glycerol, denoted 2AG. So in full, the name for this is 2-arachidinyl once again, so it's another derivative of arachidonic acid, and then this time, instead of being bound to ethanolamine, it's bound to glycerol, specifically the second alcohol group of a glycerol molecule. Okay, so both of these molecules, anandamide and 2-arachidinyl glycerol, they are endogenous molecules found within the body with structures very different from the structure of delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which binds to this receptor and activate it, and they are the molecules which the brain naturally uses to stimulate these receptors. Now, as I say, at the moment, we do not understand why neurons release these yet, okay, and what they're trying to do to other neurons. So clearly this is a signaling system. Neurons release these molecules to then influence the behavior of other neurons through this CB1 receptor, but we don't actually yet understand what the CB1 receptor's function is in the different areas of the brain. Okay, we don't understand what it is actually regulating yet. However, what we do think is that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol has all of these broad effects on the brain by stimulating these CB1 receptors in different areas of the brain, and we do believe that without this receptor, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol would have absolutely no effect on the brain whatsoever. So we believe it's fully through this receptor that it has psychoactive properties. Okay, so with that then, I will conclude my discussion of cannabis. As I said right at the start, we do only have the tip of the iceberg of an understanding as to exactly how delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol causes these effects on the human brain.